Raise your hand if you ever heard of Father Solanus Casey, an American-born priest. Probably the best kept secret in the American church. Father Solanus Casey was a Franciscan, a Capuchin priest, and he was recently beatified by Pope Francis in 2017. In order to have canonization or sainthood, we need two verified miracles after the death of the saint. During his life, he had thousands of miracles, but we need two that are medically impossible, scientifically impossible, and the healing has to be instantaneous. We have one. And it was a woman who had an incurable skin ailment, which is the same skin ailment that Father Solanus suffered with for many years. She was praying at his shrine, his tomb in Detroit, and was instantaneously healed. Needless to say, Father Solanus was a great saint, is a great saint, although not yet officially canonized. Father Solanus was born in 1870. He was ordained in 1904, and he died in 1957. So this is a modern saint. Father Solanus was a farm boy from western Wisconsin near the Mississippi, and he was the son of Irish immigrants. His parents came over from Ireland during the potato famine. And as a young man, Father Solanus, like many of us, drifted from job to job. He worked as a logger, a prison guard, and also as a streetcar driver. And one day when he was driving his streetcar, he noticed that there was a mob of people on the track, so he had to stop the streetcar. And when he stopped the car, he actually witnessed a person get murdered right before his eyes. And this was a traumatic experience for him, who came from a very loving home, never had a real encounter with brutality on that level or evil in any real way. And this struck him so much that he heard an inner voice of the Lord saying to him on that day, "What are you doing about the suffering in the world?" And that's when soon after he felt a strong calling to serve the people of God as a priest. And so he decided to join the diocesan seminary in Milwaukee, and at the time, all the classes in Milwaukee, because there are so many Germans in the area, were taught in German. So the classes were taught in German and in Latin. And because he was Irish, he didn't speak German, and he also struggled with Latin. He had a very difficult time, to the point where he had to drop out. It just couldn't hang in there. And this, of course, was devastating to him, as he was absolutely sure that the Lord spoke to his heart and told him to be a priest. It seemed like all his dreams had ended. And then Father Solanus, in union with some of his family members, began to pray a novena for his vocation as a priest to the Blessed Mother. And at the end of the novena, he experienced a calling within himself that said, "Go to Detroit. Go to Detroit. Go to the Franciscans." And so he applied to the Franciscans in Detroit, the Capuchins, and he entered into the seminary once more in Detroit. And lo and behold, because he didn't look it up online first, he realized that they also were teaching in German and in Latin. And the struggle just continued. I mean, he truly suffered. He truly suffered and barely squeaked by with like a C average. But it was really a hard time for him, where he always felt like this calling from God was completely up in the air. And when he finally graduated, he was approached by his superiors, who brought an official document to him that they wanted him to sign. And the document basically said that we can't guarantee that we are going to ordain you a priest. Can Can you imagine, after all of those years, to be presented with something like this that you have to sign? And his response was this: I'm here to do God's will, not my own. I'm here to do God's will, not my own. He was putting all of his trust, all of his faith in God, and also in his superiors. And ultimately, they did ordain him, but they ordained him in what they called back then a simplexed priesthood. They made him a simplex priest, which means he had a lot of limitations put on his priesthood. For example, he was not allowed to preach. He was considered intellectually inferior. He was not allowed to hear confessions. And this, of course, for someone who wants to be a priest and for whom this is their dream, must have been completely devastating. And yet he accepted it with incredible humility, never complained, and believed that it was God's will that was being transmitted to him through his superiors. He ultimately became a porter. He became the doorman of the monastery. And this was like a job that usually brothers would do, not priests or seminarians. And he was put in charge of the altar servers and was assigned many menial tasks, things that novices would do. After all of these years in school, can you think about that? And he did it with great joy and with great humility and never complained, trusting that all of this, although painful, was God's will for him. And things began to change in an incredible way when he became the porter, because people began to talk to him and began to realize that he was a person of compassion, an incredible listener, an incredible counselor, and that he had this gift. And he would pray over people, and people would get healed, and their prayers would be answered through him. It wasn't long that there was lines of people standing outside of the monastery, not looking for the priests, the other priests, but for Father Solanus. We're talking about lines that went all the way down the street and around the corner. Father Solanus also worked in a soup kitchen. He worked in a soup kitchen in Detroit during the Great Depression, so he had a great love for the poor and lived a humble life of service to his brothers and sisters. However, as he continued in his ministry, the Franciscans tried to kind of protect him because there were so many people who were coming to see him. And it got so bad that they ended up transferring him from Detroit to the most rural monastery that they had in Indiana, thinking that that would get him away from the crowds. But not soon after he arrived, busloads of people would come to meet him, to pray with him, to get a word of faith from him, a word of hope from him. And needless to say, he changed many lives. And as I said, thousands of miracles happened through him. In the gospel today, my brothers and sisters, we see James and John having their own agenda of what it means to be great. They want to be great. And they approach Jesus and say, "Grant that in your glory we may sit one on your right and the other on your left." They think that Jesus is going to be this great earthly king and that they are going to be famous and powerful, and they are going to be like the prime ministers with the highest positions of rank and title. They are overcome by their own pride and ambition. We want to be the best. We want to sit on your right. We want to be on your left. And Jesus responds to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Can you drink the cup that I am going to drink? Can you be baptized with the baptism with which I will be baptized?" Then Jesus summoned the other 10 disciples and said to them, "You are not to lord it over others the way the Gentiles do, but rather, whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant. and whoever wishes to be first among you must be the slave of all. My brothers and sisters, Jesus, of course, is the ultimate example of what it means to be truly great. And this comes by following the will of God and service. Following the will of God like Solanus Casey, following the will of God the way Jesus did, who said, "I do nothing apart from the Father. I only do the will of the Father." We hear in Philippians, St. Paul say about Jesus that he was so humble that he did not even grasp equality with God as something to be grasped, even though he was God himself. If there was one human being on this planet who could have lorded it over others, it was him. But yet, he took the lowest place at all times. He did the work of a slave. He washed people's feet. He did things that even his own disciples thought were beyond his dignity. Father Solanus had that same spirit, that spirit of humility and of service. And this, I believe, is why God was able to do so many great things through him. In our first reading from Isaiah, we hear a prophecy about Jesus the Messiah, who comes not as an earthly king, but as a suffering servant, who says, Isaiah tells us, "Because of his affliction, he shall see the light in the fullness of days. Through his suffering, my servant shall justify many, and their guilt he shall bear." In other words, suffering and service are what bring salvation. And Jesus does this through his cross and resurrection. Hence, the way of Christ is not about earthly power, titles and crowns, dominance, coercion, or the sword. The way of Christ is about love and service. And so today's Liturgy of the Word invites us to be truly great by following the way of Christ and service to our brothers and sisters. However, as Jesus says to the disciples today, drinking from this cup is not easy. It will require sacrifice and many challenges and perhaps many failures and many humiliations of our egos. But we won't regret it, because this truly is the path of peace and joy. We won't regret it because Jesus never asks us to do anything that he himself did not do. And when we follow him, he is always with us, as we hear in our second reading today from Hebrews. For we do not have a high priest who is not able to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has similarly been tested in every way. So let us confidently approach the throne of grace. If you look at Jesus' life, it ends on a cross, which looks like the greatest failure that ever happened, but in fact, it was the greatest victory over sin, over human selfishness, and over death itself. It seems to me that no matter what path we choose in life, suffering is inevitable. However, why would we want to suffer without God's grace? And God's grace is found on the path of love and service, to the point where even our apparent failures, like for Solanus Casey, truly make us great. And so may today's Eucharist help us to let go of the illusion that greatness comes from ourselves. For the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. And whoever wishes to be first must be the servant of all.